Hello everybody. Considering the eclipse is coming up in a day or so, I figured I'd make a little tutorial about it, and I'm totally not doing this to milk it for views, right? So I made this little thing. Only took me an hour or so. So let's hope we can keep this tutorial pretty short. I'll just be going through like creating it from scratch. It's pretty simple. You don't need a whole lot of detail in like the actual star part. It's mostly the corona, and that's luckily the most interesting part, because you get to play around with some neat procedural techniques. Here, let's open up the Blender file. Loads. You can see this is just the raw render. So no shenanigans being done. Without further ado, let's get started. So we're going to start with the sun, and then we're just going to add the moon in front of it, and then configure our camera. Center my view. And I'm going to add in a round cube. This can be grabbed from the extra meshes add-on, or extra objects. This one, you just enable this, and then when you go into the Shift A menu, add mesh, round cube, and down here, set the radius to 1, and then add in a couple more of these on this arc. I do 128 for this, which is a solid amount. You can see that it's like 200k or 100k faces, so not too shabby. Then we're going to rendered view. Should all just be black. You're going to want to delete any lights. Just leave the camera and the round cube in the scene. I'm going to change my distance because I have a my default blender is set to for like landscape renders right now, so sometimes I have to change a little bit. I'm going to create a material and call this the sun surface. I can't type. Delete the principled. This is going to be very emissive. Emission. And this is going to be quite simple. Mainly we're just going to be using a Musgrave at the base, texture coordinate. One thing I want to do here is I want to add in a vector math. Set this to normalize. What this is going to do is it's going to make sure the texture is consistent regardless of how much we displace it. So we're going to set this to multifractal, turn the detail all the way up, and the dimension down quite a bit. And then we're going to play around with the lacunarity to give us a little bit more like a speckled, spotty look. I mean, you've seen how much we see of this in the final render, right? So it's not like it's particularly important how all this looks, but this will influence the coronas and shit. We're gonna string together some math nodes. Start with a multiply and a power. This is just gonna add some contrast and stuff. And then what we want to do is we want to add a little bit of distortion. That way it doesn't look so mathematical. So we're going to add a noise texture. Scale to like 2-ish. And another vector math. Set to subtract. We're going to subtract 0.5. Then we're going to scale this. Either subtract or add it to the thing. That's gonna add some distortions. I'm gonna set the detail all the way up and then just play around with the roughness until I get something. Roughness and the strength of this. I just want to get a little bit of like almost like anisotropy in the thing, so it's like stretched out a little bit, but it doesn't look like completely warped and displaced. Like this is too much, right? This is pretty good. Play around with this. The goal is to have it look as like not procedural as possible, but also keeping it simple because it doesn't need to be super complicated. So now we are going to select everything but the normalized. Control G, and we're going to call this the sun surface. Also, don't select the emission. So this should go into the emission strength. And we're going to add in an RGB node. And this is going into the emission color. Color, mix color, yep. Duplicate this. Connect it up. And Control G. It's going to be a sun. Then we're going to plug in a factor or an input into the factor. Just for testing purposes, we're going to set this to 0 and change this to color we like. I like it to be, actually, plug this bit into the factor. Then we're going to add the math to multiply and power. And I like to choose this like lower, this one that goes into the A to be like bluish, and this one to be like yellowish, orange. Is this realistic? Not really. I mean, if you look at some of the pictures of like an eclipse, it does have some interesting colors, like especially the like infrared ones. The next thing we're going to do here is we're going to go into our material, turn the settings from this displacement from bump only to displacement only. Add in a displacement. That's pretty wild. Anyways, we are going to change the scale down to like a 101. And we are going to clamp these a little bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to math, keep it set to add, then duplicate it, set this to divide. That will clamp it effectively, and it's like a soft clamp too, which is pretty sweet. And I'm actually going to invert this by duplicating it and doing a subtract 1 minus that. That way it looks like these like brighter portions are a little bit sunken in. I find this gives a neat look. Like if I do this even more, it's a little bit more pronounced. Sort of like it's these outer bits are like cooling off or something, right? You can add as many subdivision surfaces as you want and shit, but I find actually keeping it relatively low poly is usually the best move here. Mostly because it can get like super noisy, like the geometry itself, like super spiky if you add too many, because it's a rather high frequency procedural texture, right? So I just leave it. This is enough. It's gonna be covered in bloom anyways. Anyways, that is it for the surface. Now let's add in the atmosphere. Atmosphere. What's up? Duplicate this. Sun atmosphere. And then in this displacement, we're going to change the scaled 1, mid-level to 0, height to like 2. And by the way, Look at what happens when I scale this down, right? Texture remains consistent. That's what this normalize does here. And this is going to be quite important. So we're going to turn this emission from the surface to the volume. Now we get it, it's like spiky and shit. It's pretty cool. Duplicate this normalize, set this to length. Subtract 1. We do a maximum of -1. Then multiply this by a number. It can be high, like 30 to 40-ish. Power node. Just leave it. Plug that into the second one. And we're going to multiply this by that. Voila. And we're going to plug this bit into the input for that multiply that goes into the sun color. And you can change it up a little bit. That's pretty cool, but this looks interesting to say the least. Like this looks neat, but it doesn't like give us the like actual realistic effects that we want. Like it looks super spiky. So what we can do is we can take this length and the subtract. I'm going to duplicate this maximum too. This time set to like 0. It is pretty cool how it's like a sun glowy effect. And we're going to essentially blur this texture the farther it gets out away from the surface. So we're going to do multiply. Actually, in this case, we want scale. We're going to do an add. And we're going to add in a white noise. White noise is essentially just a random function. Anywhere you sample it, it'll just be a completely random number. Technically pseudo-random, but oh well. So plug that into the vector input of the scale. It's going to become a multiplier. You can set this like 0.1. So that maximum and that multiply goes into the second input. If we plug this in there, see it's getting a little bit blurred, but when we increase this, we have a little bit of a problem. It's like not symmetrical, so it's all getting shifted over a bit. So we have to subtract 0.5 from each channel. Now you can see like that's a good solid blur. And it's blurring it more the farther out we go from the surface, which is pretty sweet. You don't want it too much. Yeah, like that's pretty good. We will come back to this later. We just want to sort of get the foundation and we can fine tune this. So let's actually create like the solar flares and stuff that we see, all those like magnetic lines or whatever they're called. It's actually, this method that we're going to be using is pretty simple. So we're going to start out by creating like the really big ones, and then we'll make some smaller-ish ones. So let's start out by duplicating these 3 nodes. Because we'll need to reuse them. Then we're going to add a noise texture. Set the detail to 0, set the scale to like 1. This is going, actually we need a normalized node too. So there we go, we got our noise texture. Now in this color output, this is what we'll be using. We're going to add another vector math, this time set to subtract 0.5 from each channel. Then we're going to multiply this by just the red and the green. And then we are going to normalize this. This gives us a little bit of an interesting pattern. It's like super, the change is super sharp around these bits. And we can use that to our advantage. And I want to give a quick teaser of how. So I'm going to turn to Musgrave. Like, look at that. That was pretty sweet. The reason why this happens is because when you normalize this thing, it's essentially just turning into like a 1D texture because you have 2 dimensions that are being normalized. So it's like when you turn when you plug a like a texture into a 1D thing, spread it over a 2D surface, or God forbid even a 3D surface, it gets these like streaky lines and stuff, especially if it's continuous. That's kind of a strange explanation, but it might help. Anyways, we're going to change this to multifractal, turn the detail up and the dimension down. Next thing we're going to do is we are going to, instead of using multiply, we're going to do a separate XYZ and a combine XYZ. Plug the X and Y into here, and then this length into the Z. We're going to add a multiply for this. Like something. And then we will be plugging this into the volume. And add some math nodes. Multiply and power is always good after a Musgrave texture. Just control the brightness and the like contrast. So, and you can see already how this is making something look super deep. I don't need this much contrast though. So now we're going to do this thing that we did over here. Just sort of control the fall off. So we're going to do let's multiply. We keep this at maximum, but we want to turn this one all the way down. And we multiply this by that. Voila. Pretty sweet. Now we need to add color, so we're just going to duplicate these 4 nodes down here. Plug this into that. So now it's just a matter of like controlling how big these things get. You can go pretty wild. Another quick tip that I haven't covered. AGX will make a lot of the bright parts like super desaturated. I like to do filmic. That way I can get like a little bit more saturation if I want to, right? Like these are gonna remain like super yellow. That is fantastic. Delete that multiply now. Then I'm gonna add in an add shader. We're essentially gonna do the same thing, but we want to make it like a little bit smaller. I'm also gonna play with this Musgrave just to see, because sometimes it can get like a little bit noisy if you aren't careful. Like you just wanna make sure it's not going too crazy, you know. That looks pretty good. Yep. Now this add shader, I'm just gonna plug this in the second input and then we can connect that up. We want to create like uh, some smaller solar flares, so we're gonna turn this multiply up and turn this noise texture, the scale quite a bit up. You can also make this like a lot brighter. And a little bit more contrasty because you can afford it, you know. Basically get it so that it blends in quite well with the edges here. Like that looks pretty good, I think. We add this back. The transition is a little bit better than just this, because that was kind of bland. This makes it look a little bit more full, you know. Just control the color so that it blends nicely. And duplicate this again. Add back in that first atmosphere. Control the fall off of this a little bit. You go into the surface and make it a lot brighter. We want this sun surface to be significantly brighter than everything else because it's going to be the thing that's like casting the glare. Shit, so I'm going to turn this up to 5, and I'm just going to darken everything else. So I'm just going to add another multiply and multiply by like 0.1 on each of these. Turn this exposure back up. That looks pretty sweet. Let's make sure the colors are a little bit more consistent. That looks a little bit sketchy right now. Once we add in the moon and stuff, I think it'll be a bit better. You can probably add a little bit more of this stuff. Yeah, that's probably fine. So now what we want to do is we're going to go out of render mode, and then we will configure our camera. You're going to one of the orthographic views. I'm just going to select one. That way I'm viewing the XC plane. center my view and scroll way out. And then in our camera tab, we're going to turn this way up. That way this is super big. And we can set up our scene here. So now we need to add in the moon. Also, that camera is hilarious. So I'm just going to duplicate one of our round cubes. Not surface one. Just put it in the Y. Scale it down slightly so we can just see the sun peeking through. Call this the moon. I want to delete all this, actually, except for the displacement. Control T to add in the texture. Set this to generated and sphere. Then I'm going to go grab a moon texture. You can find these online for free. Moon displacement texture. So let's see, find textures, moon textures. Let me grab the 23K one. This one I did not get for free. I bought it, but you can find like perfectly high res ones that are completely serviceable for this task. Like produced by NASA for free. So let's see if this works. This one we are going to want some subdivisions on. Generate a subdivision surface. You can rotate it to use something you want. Level to 0. You don't want to go too crazy, but you want to just get enough that you can see some clear ridges. Scale it up so it's like just about as big. Move it a little bit. That way it gives you like some neat effects, you know. Like if there's a lot of glare over here and not as much over there. That's a super interesting touch, you know. I'd recommend isolating the view of your camera here. Maybe actually, compositionally speaking, it might work better to do something like this. Just off center. You never want anything to be like too symmetric because then it doesn't feel like real at all, you know? Press F12 to render it. You can see like how fast this renders. It's wild. I'm rendering 4K, albeit I do have a 4090. It's 30 seconds and it's done. That's pretty good. Now we want to do quickly. I'm also going to turn off denoise here. Just sort of check relative exposure levels. You want this sun portion to be substantially brighter than everything else. That way it's the thing that mainly casts the glare. I don't think this is bright enough. So I am going to go into the sun's surface and just turn it up to like 3 times what it was. And I'm rendering it super low exposure because we've already seen what the rest of this looks like. Yeah, that's good. That's gonna cast some really nice glare. So I've turned this up to normal exposure levels. It doesn't, yeah, it doesn't look too offensive here either. So now we will save it as an EXR, and we're going to bring it into a program to add some really nice glare, way better than you can do in Blender's compositor. It is called Real Bloom. So I'm going to save this, and then I will be right back. By the way, saving it to DWAA is best. It'll save the most space. Save as. Oops. All right. Gotta boot into Windows, and I'll be right back. Alrighty, so this is Real Bloom. You can get it from the GitHub repository in the description. Just install it. They have instructions over there. I built a custom build of it with some extra UI stuff, but the base functionality is the same. Anyways, so you'll see a couple of these slots over here. What we're going to be paying attention to is the convolution input and convolution kernel. If you want to make your own convolution kernel, that's where these diffraction and dispersions come in. But I already have one, and I'll be sharing it with you guys, so you probably don't need to mess around with that. Anyways, you want to go into your File Explorer, grab your render. So I'm going to choose one that I already had made for this because I'm too lazy to port the one that I just made over to this program because it's on a different computer and such. This is plugged into our convolution input. And on our convolution kernel, we are going to drag the lens flare that I provided or a custom one that you made into this slot the same way that we did before. So I'm going to grab one here. So this is the kernel I made. I made this in Houdini, and as I said before, you can pick this up below. It is pretty sweet. It's meant to be, it's quite similar to the James Webb kernel. I have it rotate a little bit. You do not need to. I like it a little bit off axis. And then when we go into the convolution result and we press convolve, it will apply our convolution kernel to the image that this convolution input. That is essentially what gives us the glare. Now you can turn off additive, or just blending is basically how much glare there is. So I can turn up the convolution stuff. It's a very simple program, very intuitive, which is why I'm not going too crazy over explaining it. And up here, when you're done, just click save and save it to the folder that you want it to. You can choose which type. Play around. You can also play around over here with like different color spaces and such. Although I would recommend exporting it in display native, which for EXRs will be linear, and then doing any compositing in like DaVinci. Yeah, it's just easier that way. But that's pretty much it. Hope you enjoyed and learned something at least. I'll see you folks later. Happy Eclipse watching.